goddamn tree in that easement. Go wider before he gets out here.
Jabbing one French-tipped fingernail at the 80-year-old cottonwoods my grandfather had planted along the Powder River bottom. The chains roared. A row of cottonwoods older than the state of Wyoming hit the ground at 6:15 on a cold morning the day after I had buried my uncle. I came across the upper pasture in my late uncle's barn coat, with my coffee in one hand and my phone recording in the other. Della turned, smoothed her Patagonia vest, and gave me a smile polished enough to close a corporate merger. "Mr. Ardmore," she said, "condolences."
Sign the renewal and we'll stop.
Behind her, the saws kept eating cottonwood. Behind me, the Wyoming Public Service Commission was about to find out what she was burning. She didn't know the easement she was clearing on my land had a termination clause my grandfather had signed in 1958. Drop your state in the comments. My name is Quinn Ardmore. I'm 56 years old, and 3 months ago I retired from a 27-year career as a senior transmission engineer with the Western Area Power Administration, designing high-voltage interconnects across the 11 western states for what some folks call the federal grid, and what most folks have never heard of in their lives. I came home to Sheridan County, Wyoming in March because my uncle Garth Ardmore had died in his sleep, in the same upstairs bedroom of the same farmhouse where my grandfather Hollister Ardmore had been born in 1924, where my mother Marjorie had grown up, and where my uncle had raised me after my parents died on a winter highway outside Buffalo, Wyoming, in 1987. My wife Linnea did not get to retire with me. She died of ALS in late 2021, after 14 months of the slow goodbye that disease forces you to learn. Our daughter Wren is 26. She graduated from the University of Pittsburgh Dental School last May, and is now an associate dentist in a small practice in Bozeman, Montana. She drives down on weekends when her schedule lets her. She has her mother's eyes, her mother's stubborn calm, and her mother's habit of correcting my grammar in the middle of dinner. The ranch is 1,700 acres of East Slope Bighorn foothills, shortgrass prairie, cottonwood bottom along the Powder River fork, sagebrush bench above the lower pasture, and a single ridge of ponderosa where my grandfather had built the original homestead in 1947. Wyoming wind, Wyoming sky, Wyoming silence, the kind of country that makes a man understand why his grandfather had once written, in a 1958 letter to my mother, that this land would outlast everyone who ever tried to put their fence on it. Running across the upper third of the ranch, in a north-south corridor about 40 feet wide on paper, is a power line easement. That easement is the spine of this story, so let me tell you about it. In 1958, my grandfather Hollister Ardmore signed a private easement deed granting 4 neighboring ranchers the right to run a 4,160-volt distribution line across his land, from the regional cooperative grid to the south to the small ranches to the north. He was a careful man. He wrote the deed himself. He limited the voltage. He limited the width. He limited the duration to 99 years. He included an annual fee paid by the user, and he included a termination clause, in plain English, that said the easement could be terminated by the lineal heir of the grantor, upon written notice to the user with 180 days grace, in the event of unauthorized expansion of scope, voltage, or width. That clause, on a yellow piece of carbon paper, sat in a fireproof box in my Uncle Garth's office for 67 years. I remember my Uncle Garth, the summer I turned 14, taking me up to that office one evening and showing me the box. He did not open it. He just tapped the lid with 2 fingers and said, "Quinn, the worst day of your life, this box opens. Until then, you leave it closed." I did not understand him at the time. I had grown up on a ranch where the closed boxes were kept closed and the open boxes were kept open, and adults did not generally explain why. I left the office. I forgot about the box for 42 years. In 2010, a developer named Theron Vosberg bought 800 acres of benchland just north of the ranch, hired a fast Cheyenne engineering firm, got himself a county zoning approval, and built 180 luxury homes on what had previously been 4 small cattle operations. The cooperative grid, on the original 1958 easement, had served those 4 ranches with a few thousand watts of barn lights and well pumps. The new development needed 38,000 homes worth of capacity. The developer's engineers, in an act of confidence I will charitably describe as careless, simply upgraded the line through my uncle's ranch from 4,160 volts to 24,900 volts, widened the cleared right-of-way from 40 feet to roughly 80, and never once filed a scope amendment with the Wyoming Public Service Commission, my uncle, or the Department of Agriculture. He named the development Cloud Peak Estates. His wife, Adelaide Vosberg, who preferred to be called Della, became its first HOA board president. The first time she crossed our property line was the morning after my uncle's funeral. That was the day she made her first mistake. It would not be her last. Della Vosberg stood in front of a yellow logging skidder with the 80-year-old cottonwood my grandfather had planted in 1947, lying in 3 pieces at her boots. Her Patagonia vest was zipped. Her boots were waterproof. Her hair was so blonde the cold morning sun bounced off it like off a snowfield. The chainsaw crew had stopped when I came down the slope, but she had not. "Mr. Ardmore," she said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Truly. Garth was a wonderful man. We didn't expect to be here today, but unfortunately, Cloud Peak Estates has been operating under a renewal protocol that requires us to refresh our right-of-way clearance every 5 years, and our window with the cooperative ends today. We hate the timing. We really do." I looked at the cottonwood. I looked at the chainsaw crew. I looked at the 80 feet of cleared ground that, on the easement deed in my uncle's office, was supposed to be 40. I lifted my phone and continued recording. "Mrs. Vosberg," I said, "you are on my property. Your crew is operating saws on my land. The trees you are cutting are mine. The cleared right-of-way you are widening is twice what the recorded easement permits. I am asking you, calmly, to instruct your crew to stop and to leave my property within 10 minutes. She smiled the kind of smile a corporate executive uses on a stalled merger. "Mr. Ardmore," she said, "I understand this is emotional for you. The reality is, the existing easement covers reasonable maintenance access. The board's interpretation has always been that the right-of-way required to safely service modern infrastructure is broader than the original 1958 paper. We have been operating under this interpretation since 2010. Garth never objected. We have a folder of correspondence." "I am not Garth," I said. "I'm Quinn. I'm his lineal heir. The easement transferred to me at probate yesterday morning, and I'm objecting now." She blinked, twice. Her smile didn't crack, it just slowed down. "I'd like the saws stopped," I said, "and I'd like you and your crew off my land within 10 minutes. She instructed the foreman to stop the saws. She instructed the crew to leave. Then she walked up the slope to her white SUV with the HOA logo magnetic on the door, opened the back, pulled out a manila folder, and handed it to me. "In light of your loss," she said, "the board has prepared a courtesy renewal package. It updates the easement to reflect current operating standards, formalizes the right-of-way at its actual width, and waives a portion of the back fees you are now jointly responsible for. We're being very generous, Mr. Ardmore. I'd encourage you to sign before this becomes complicated." I did not open the folder. I held it loose in my hand and watched her drive away. 3 days later, the first formal letter arrived. It was 12 pages of HOA logo letterhead, citing me for obstruction of easement maintenance and demanding payment of $146,000 in back maintenance fees, dating from 2010 to present, plus interest. The second letter, a week later, demanded I sign the renewal package within 60 days or face civil action. The third, a week after that, threatened to involve the Regional Electric Cooperative, which the HOA claimed would be forced to disconnect Cloud Peak Estates and sue me for the resulting damages. I responded in writing to each letter, with copies sent certified to the Wyoming Public Service Commission, the Regional Cooperative Manager, and a friend at the Federal Rural Utilities Service in Washington. I cited statute. I cited the 1958 easement deed. I attached photographs of the cottonwood damage. I cited the Wyoming statutes covering unauthorized scope expansion of private utility easement. Della Vosberg ignored every reply. That same week, my Uncle Garth's old neighbor, an 81-year-old retired range scientist named Stony Reeves, drove up to the ranch in his '76 Ford pickup. He climbed out slow, leaned his cane against the bumper, and walked up to my porch with the quiet purpose of a man who had seen everything at least once. "Quinn," he said, "I knew Hollister. I knew Garth. I'm going to tell you what I told both of them. The only times either of them ever needed it told. There's two kinds of fights on this prairie. The kind where you yell and the kind where you wait. Yelling fights you lose tomorrow. Waiting fights you win in court 10 years from now. Pick the right kind." I told him I had already picked. He nodded. He climbed back into his pickup and drove off. For the rest of that week, his old Ford parked in my driveway every morning at first light, just so anyone passing on County Road 43 would see he had taken a side. That afternoon, I drove into Sheridan and bought 10 cellular trail cameras with thermal night vision, 3 reinforced gate padlocks, a fireproof safe rated for documents, and a long-handled survey transit from a closing-out estate auction at the back of an old hardware store. I drove home, set up the cameras along the easement corridor, the upper bench gate, the river crossing, and the ridge above the Ponderosa stand. I locked every original 1958 deed copy and Garth's correspondence into the safe in my office, and I started a fresh log on the kitchen table in the green field notebook my uncle had used to track precipitation since 1981. That evening I walked the cottonwood line at sunset. The cut trunks were already weeping clear sap from the ends. The wood smelled, very faintly, of the same green sweetness I remembered from the summer my uncle and I had cleared deadfall down the same stretch of river bottom in 1992. There were 3 magpies standing on the largest fallen trunk, calling at each other in the slow Wyoming way magpies do. I sat down on the next stump over and watched them for a long while. I thought about how long it takes a cottonwood to reach 80 feet, and how short it takes a chainsaw to take it down. I thought about who, exactly, had decided that an old tree was a regulatory inconvenience. The harassment campaign expanded the next week. A Sheridan County weed and pest officer named Holland Truitt rolled up the gravel drive in a county-marked pickup. He was apologetic before he stepped out of the cab. He told me, holding his clipboard at his side rather than out front the way enforcement officers usually do, that a complaint had been filed alleging knapweed and hound's-tongue infestation in my pastures. He had to walk the lower bench to confirm. He walked it for an hour. He came back to my porch and pulled off his hat to wipe his forehead. "Mr. Ardmore," he said, "this is the cleanest 40-section pasture I have surveyed in this county in 3 years. There is nothing here. I'm marking the complaint as unfounded, and I'm flagging it as potentially harassing. This is the second false report I've gotten on adjacent ranches this year. The other was against a sheep operation up near Story." He told me, off the record, who had filed the complaint. Vosburgh, A.M. The next visitor, a week later, was Kit Bensonhurst, the regional manager of the Powder River Rural Electric Cooperative. Kit was 62, lean, careful, the kind of cooperative manager who had spent 30 years balancing the demands of ranchers and small towns with the regulations of the Wyoming Public Service Commission. He had known my Uncle Garth since the 1980s. He drove out personally because he had received my certified letter, and he wanted to see the easement corridor with his own eyes. We walked it together. He took photographs. He took voltage measurements at the nearest line transformer. When he finished, he stood in the cleared right-of-way with his hat in his hands and looked at me with an expression I have not forgotten. "Quinn," he said, "I am going to tell you something I should have known and did not. The cooperative's records list this line as a 4,160-volt distribution feeder. The line itself, today, is operating at 24,900 volts. Somebody upgraded the conductors and reset the regulators in 2010 without filing the upgrade with us, with the PSC, or with anyone else who should have been notified. My understanding has always been that the upgrade was the cooperative's responsibility. It was not. It was filed under a private engineering firm contract paid for by the developer of Cloud Peak Estates. It was never properly inspected, never properly permitted, and it has been running outside spec for 15 years. I asked him what that meant for me. He looked at the cleared corridor. He looked at the distant roof lines of Cloud Peak Estates against the foothills. "Quinn," he said, "it means the easement on your land is being used in a manner the original deed does not permit. It means Cloud Peak Estates has been receiving power across your land under unauthorized infrastructure. It means a lot of paperwork is about to get filed. and it means your grandfather, in 1958, may have written a deed clause sharper than anybody who came after him bothered to read. He gave me the cell number of his counterpart at the Wyoming Public Service Commission, a senior staff engineer named Annette Pillsbury, and told me to call her on Monday morning. He told me to bring everything. Before he climbed back into his pickup, he stopped at the gate, took off his glasses, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him in the 30 years I had known him. "Quinn," he said, "I'm going to be candid. The cooperative is going to take a black eye out of this. We should have caught the upgrade in 2010, and we did not. I am asking you, on behalf of 1,500 member ranches in this region, to do this carefully. Don't pull the plug on Cloud Peak Estates grandmothers in February. Use the legal clock. Use the regulatory process. Do it the slow Wyoming way, the kind that holds up later." I told him I would. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of my uncle's whiskey, watching the sun go down behind the Bighorn skyline. The cottonwoods Della Vosburg had cut 3 weeks earlier stood as a row of broken stumps along the river bottom. The wind moved through what was left of the upper bench grasses. A nighthawk called once from the Ponderosa Ridge. I thought about my grandfather Hollister, sitting at his kitchen table in 1958 with a yellow tablet and a fountain pen, writing a clause in plain English that he hoped no one would ever need. I thought about my Uncle Garth, who had kept that paper in a fireproof box for 67 years without ever needing to open it. And I thought about Della Vosburg, who in the morning after a funeral had stood in front of a logging skidder and told me my objection was emotional. I went inside. I called Wren in Bozeman. I told her I was about to start something that was going to take a year. I asked her to come down the next weekend if she could. She said she'd be there Friday. That night I went up to my uncle's office for the first time since the funeral. The fireproof box was where it had always been, on the second shelf of the locked cabinet beside his old roll-top desk. I took the key off the brass hook above the door, the way Garth had shown me when I was 14, and I unlocked the cabinet. The box was dustier than I remembered. The lid opened with a soft metallic sound that, for some reason, almost made me cry. Inside, in a manila envelope on top of every other paper, was the 1958 easement deed, written in my grandfather's careful hand, on yellow legal paper that had not been touched by daylight in 67 years. I read the termination clause 3 times by the desk lamp. I closed the box. I put the key back on the brass hook. I sat on the floor of the office for 10 minutes in complete silence. The lawsuit arrived the following Tuesday. The Cloud Peak Estates Homeowners Association had filed a declaratory judgment action in Sheridan County District Court, asking the court to confirm that the existing right-of-way and operational scope of the power line through my property was, by long-standing practice and reasonable interpretation, a permanent and unchangeable feature of the parties' relationship. They asked, in the alternative, for a court-ordered modification of the original 1958 easement to reflect current operational reality. They also asked for a temporary injunction restraining me from any action that might interrupt, impair, or interfere with the existing infrastructure. I read the petition twice on my front porch, with the wind moving through what was left of the cottonwoods. Then I called Vernon Crowell, a small-town country lawyer in Sheridan who had handled my grandfather's, my uncle's, and now my land issues across 3 generations of Ardmores. Vernon was 63, soft-spoken, and one of the sharpest contract lawyers in northern Wyoming. He read the petition slowly over the phone. When he was done, he said one word: brazen. He told me to come to his office at 8 a.m. the next morning. He told me to bring the original 1958 easement deed, my uncle's correspondence file, the photographs of the right-of-way clearing, the cooperative's voltage findings, and a thermos of dark roast from the diner on Main. I brought all of it. Vernon's office was a single-room practice on the second floor of a 1922 brick building above a saddle shop, with one window that looked out onto the Burlington Northern Tracks, and a slow ceiling fan that had been turning since the Eisenhower administration. He spread the documents across his conference table the way a poker player spreads a winning hand. He read for 2.5 hours. He muttered. He underlined. He wrote, in long Wyoming longhand, termination clause and unauthorized scope expansion across separate sheets of yellow legal pad. Finally, he leaned back, folded his hands across his stomach, and looked at me over his reading glasses. "Quinn," he said, "this case is junk. Their declaratory judgment is fiction. Their interpretation theory has no precedent in Wyoming utility law. The court ought to throw it out at first appearance." But Judge Castile is presiding, and Judge Castile, while not in any way corrupt, is a procedural conservative who will not move quickly on a complex easement matter. She'll grant the temporary injunction, freeze everything, and set a 6-month schedule. That's exactly what Della Vosburg wants. She wants delay. She wants time to establish more facts on the ground. She wants you to settle out of exhaustion. How do we not let that happen? He smiled, slowly, the way a country lawyer smiles when he's already thought past the obvious move. "Quinn," he said, "the district court is the wrong forum. You are not going to win in district court. You're going to file a parallel complaint with the Wyoming Public Service Commission tomorrow morning. The PSC has primary regulatory jurisdiction over private utility easements with public service connections. They will move faster than any court. They will subpoena the cooperative's records. They will compel disclosure of the 2010 upgrade documentation. And while the district court is grinding through its preliminary motion schedule, the PSC is going to find that the line has been operating outside its lawful scope for 15 years. I asked him about the easement termination clause. He smiled wider. "You are going to file your termination notice with the HOA, certified mail, by close of business today. The 180-day clock starts now. By the time the district court gets to its first substantive hearing, your clock will be at day 90. By the time the PSC issues its preliminary findings, your clock will be at day 120. And by the time anyone in Cloud Peak Estates figures out what is happening, the clock will be at day 175. And you will be 7 days from contractually de-energizing the line on your own property." I sat in his office for a long minute and let that timeline settle. Then I asked him what we should do in the meantime. He said, "We tell nobody. We let the HOA fight the district court case while we win the regulatory war underneath them. And on day 180, if Della Vosburg has not negotiated, you walk to the disconnect at the southern fence line and you flip the switch." I drove home that afternoon with a notarized termination notice in a manila folder on my passenger seat and a parallel PSC complaint ready to file in the morning. I took the long way home through Story because I wanted to think. The next morning, I drove down to Cheyenne. The Wyoming Public Service Commission's offices are on the 3rd floor of a 1968 limestone state building in the Capitol, with one elevator that smells like dust and one window in the conference room that looks out at the rotunda. Annette Pillsbury met me at the front desk. She was 48, sharp, and had spent 22 years investigating private utility easement disputes across the state. She read my complaint at her desk for 40 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, her expression was the expression of an engineer who has just been handed a problem she has been waiting 15 years to find. "Mr. Ardmore," she said, "I need you to leave this file with me. I need you to come back in 2 weeks, and I need you to brace yourself, because the cooperative is about to be on the receiving end of a regulatory inquiry that will land in the Cheyenne newspapers within 30 days. I left the file. I drove home in the slow Wyoming afternoon light. That same week, I called my old WAPA colleague, Dr. Alaric Fenton, who had retired from the agency in 2019 and now consulted on transmission infrastructure cases out of Fort Collins. Alaric drove up the next Tuesday with 2 binders and a coffee thermos. He spent 4 days walking the easement corridor with me, taking voltage readings, photographing transformers, examining the conductor specifications, and pulling the developer's 2010 engineering filings from the Wyoming State Archives. His report, when it landed on my kitchen table at the end of the week, ran to 211 pages. The summary, in the first paragraph, contained one sentence I will not forget. The line through Mr. Ardmore's property, as currently operated, is in violation of the original easement scope, the Wyoming Public Service Commission, permitting requirements, Federal Rural Utilities Service safety standards, and Cloud Peak Estates' own developer commitments to its 2010 county zoning approval. That sentence, by itself, was enough to dissolve an HOA. Wren came down from Bozeman the second weekend of April. She walked the easement corridor with me at dusk. She listened to me explain the voltage upgrade, the termination clause, the 80-foot clearing, the unauthorized 2010 work. When I finished, she stood at the edge of the cottonwood line and looked at the ruined trees for a long minute. "Dad," she said, "Mom always said you'd never lose a fight you took notes on." I told her I had already started taking notes. She smiled. She put her arm through mine. "Take more." We walked back to the farmhouse the long way, through the upper bench, past the small headstone my uncle had set in 2019 for his old border collie. The wind was picking up off the foothills the way it does in early spring. Wren told me, somewhere along the trail, that her mother had once said the Ardmore men were slow to anger, slower to forgive, and absolutely impossible to outwait. She told me that line had stayed with her through dental school. She told me she was glad she could finally see it from the inside. Over the next 4 weeks, Vernon Crowell, Annette Pillsbury, Kit Bensonhurst, Alaric Fenton, and I built the regulatory case the way you build a transmission tower. Foundation first, steel up, one bolt at a time. We filed the parallel PSC complaint. We attached Alaric's engineering report. We attached the 1958 easement deed. We attached photographs of the cleared right-of-way. We attached the cooperative's voltage findings. We attached my uncle's 1981 to 2009 correspondence with the cooperative, which contained no record of any voltage upgrade authorization. We attached the developer's 2010 county zoning application, which described the line as existing infrastructure without disclosing the upgrade. Within 72 hours, the PSC issued a formal preliminary inquiry. Within 10 days, they had subpoenaed the cooperative's records, the developer's records, and the HOA's correspondence files. Meanwhile, I drafted, with Vernon, a public information letter to every resident of Cloud Peak Estates. The letter explained, in plain English, the 1958 easement, the 2010 upgrade, the termination clock, the alternate routing options that existed. A reroute around the eastern boundary of my property would cost approximately $3.4 million and take 90 days to construct. And an open invitation to a community information session at the Sheridan County Extension Office on the first Tuesday in May. We mailed the letter certified, on Vernon's letterhead, to every home in Cloud Peak. The Cloud Peak HOA tried to file an emergency motion in district court to block the mailing on grounds of harassment of residents. Judge Castile, to her credit, denied the motion within 90 minutes, with a one-paragraph order noting that public information about a regulatory matter affecting residents' utility infrastructure is not, in any reasonable interpretation, harassment. The Tuesday evening community session at the Extension Office was scheduled for 7. By 6:45, the parking lot was full. By 7, the staff had set up additional folding chairs in the hallway. By 7:15, we had moved the entire meeting outside into the gravel lot under the loading dock awning, because 210 people had shown up. Annette Pillsbury spoke first. She explained, in 12 plain English minutes, what the Wyoming Public Service Commission's regulatory authority over private utility easements was, what the 2010 upgrade had violated, and what the residents could expect over the next 60 days. Kit Bensonhurst spoke next, with the cooperative's records spread on a folding table behind him. Alaric Fenton spoke third, walking through the conductor specifications and the voltage findings with the patience of a man who had taught Engineering 101 for 10 years. Then Vernon Crowell spoke. He held up the 1958 easement deed. He read the termination clause aloud, in my grandfather's exact wording, with the audience leaning forward in the cool Wyoming dusk. He told them the clock had started on the day after my uncle's funeral. He told them I had already filed the termination notice. He told them, on the date the clock expired, the line on my property could be lawfully de-energized. He told them their HOA had failed to disclose any of this to them. The silence in that gravel lot was the loudest silence I have ever heard. A retired range hydrologist named Carolyn Pelfrey stood up in the second row and asked the question every face in the audience was already wearing. "Mr. Crowell," she said, "are you telling us our HOA is 6 months from losing power for the entire neighborhood?" He told her yes. He told her, very plainly, that they were. A man 2 rows back, who I later learned was a retired highway patrol captain named Lowell Kirkwood, stood up, looked at his wife, and walked out of the gravel lot without speaking. I knew, watching him leave, that the next 48 hours were going to break the Cloud Peak HOA in half from the inside. It took Della Vosberg less than 15 hours to figure out what had happened. By Wednesday morning, the Cloud Peak Facebook group was in a knife fight with itself. The post Della put up, trying to spin the public session as Quinn Ardmore's bullying tactics against vulnerable homeowners, was buried under 301 comments, of which the kindest read, "We were never told any of this. Why?" By Wednesday afternoon, 14 Cloud Peak residents had quietly emailed Vernon Crowell's office, asking how to file individual claims against the developer for failure to disclose easement risk. By Thursday, that number was 47. By Friday, the Sheridan Press ran its first article. The reporter was Briar Knox, a 30-something with a master's in environmental policy, and the kind of byline the Cheyenne State House already knew. She had been at the Tuesday public session. Her article, run above the fold under the headline, "The Easement Cloud Peak Forgot It Needed," included photographs of the cleared right-of-way, a sidebar interview with Alaric Fenton, and a single quote from me. I would prefer not to de-energize the line. The Casper Star-Tribune picked it up the next morning. The Wyoming Public Media radio desk had it by Sunday. By Monday, the Denver Post had a reporter calling Vernon's office. Della responded the way Della responded to everything. She doubled down. She filed a public statement with the Cloud Peak HOA, insisting that the termination notice was an act of retaliation by an emotionally unstable retiree. She gave an on-camera interview to a regional cable station, in which she described me as a man who came home for a funeral and decided to extort his neighbors. She tried to organize a residents' rally outside my main gate. 8 people showed up. 2 of them, Caroline Pelfrey and Lowell Kirkwood, showed up holding signs that read, "Reroute the line." The other 6 left within an hour. By the second week of May, the Cloud Peak HOA's secretary, a woman named Bryn Marsden, who had served on the board for 4 years, resigned in writing and emailed me a copy of every internal HOA email about the easement, going back to 2018. Della had instructed the board, more than once, to manage the optics of the original 1958 deed without alarming residents. She had personally vetoed a 2022 staff suggestion to engage outside legal counsel to review the easement scope. She had, in a 2023 email, Bryn included in her resignation file, written the sentence, "As long as Garth Ardmore is alive, the easement is operationally fine. We deal with the air issue later." I forwarded Bryn's email to Vernon. I forwarded it to Annette Pillsbury at the PSC. I forwarded it to Briar Knox at the Sheridan Press. That night, after Wren had gone to bed in her old upstairs room, Vernon called me with a single sentence. "Quinn," he said, "you need to add cameras tonight. I am hearing things from a friend in Cheyenne. They are about to do something stupid." I did exactly what he said. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed at 2:11 a.m. It was a motion alert from the trail camera mounted in the cottonwood line 40 yards from the southern fence transformer. I sat up in bed. The Wyoming dark was prairie dark, full of coyote song and far-off freight train. I opened the camera app. 5 figures in dark hoodies and headlamps stood in the cleared right-of-way. One was working a handheld trencher into the soil along the line corridor. 2 were laying coils of buried cable. 2 more stood at a small portable generator. The figure standing watch with arms folded wore boots that did not look like work boots, and a vest that did not look like a work vest, and her hair, when the headlamps caught it, was so blonde it threw a small, bright reflection back into the camera lens. Della. I rolled the secondary camera. The trencher was cutting an underground cable trench, parallel to the existing above-ground line. They were burying a redundant feed. They were trying to establish a physical fact on the ground, a buried cable that, in a future hearing, the HOA could argue was long-standing, undisturbed, and therefore presumptively authorized. It was a stunt I had read about twice in WAPA case histories. It had worked once and failed badly the other time. I called Sheriff Decker Olmsted first. He picked up on the second ring, his voice already alert. "Quinn." "Decker, I have 5 unidentified persons currently on my property, illegally trenching and burying unauthorized cable in a state-regulated easement corridor while criminal proceedings are pending. 2:11 a.m. I have all 5 on multiple cameras. One is Della Vosberg. Stay inside, he said. I'll have 3 units there in 14 minutes. I stayed inside. I called Annette Pillsbury at her cell. She picked up on the second ring with the calm of a senior PSC engineer who had told me, 2 weeks earlier, to call her at any hour during the active investigation. Annette, they are burying unauthorized cable on my property, right now. Get a PSC inspector to the southern fence line at first light. Sheriff is on his way for the arrest. On it. I watched the cameras. The trencher kept cutting. The cable kept laying. They did not, however, know about the cellular trail cams, or the secondary thermal cameras Alaric had helped me wire into the cottonwoods 2 weeks earlier, on the chance of exactly this kind of move. The footage kept recording. 14 minutes later, 3 cruisers came down the gravel road, lights off until the last 50 yards. They pulled wide on the easement corridor from 2 directions, lights on at the same instant. The footage on my phone showed 5 figures freezing in 9 flashlight beams, hands going up, trencher dropping, cable falling. Della's voice, suddenly small and very high, asking if she could please call her husband. By 3:30 a.m., she was in handcuffs. The 4 men with her, 2 contractors she had paid in cash, the HOA Vice President Wyatt Halverson, and a Cheyenne electrical contractor she had retained on a private invoice, were in handcuffs beside her. The buried cable, when forensics traced it, ran 260 feet inside the original easement corridor, completely outside the recorded right-of-way, in soil that had been undisturbed since 1958. Decker came up to my porch where I was waiting with coffee. He took the mug. He looked at me. "Quinn," he said, "she's been caught at 2:11 in the morning, on your property, illegally installing unauthorized utility infrastructure inside an easement corridor, under active state regulatory inquiry, while a civil case is pending. Do you know how many felonies that just stacked?" I said I had a guess. He said, "You have no idea." Off the record, in the cruiser on the way to county lockup, Della tried to invoke her husband's name twice, each time more loudly. The deputy did not respond. She tried to invoke a state senator's name. The deputy did not respond. Then she went silent for 19 miles. Just before the booking station, she asked, in a small, flat voice, what was going to happen to her dogs. The deputy told me later he had to roll the front window down to keep from saying something unprofessional in the rearview mirror. The next morning, the Sheridan Press ran Briar Knox's 3rd article, front page, above the fold. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested at 2:11 a.m., installing unauthorized cable across ranch. She sued in court." By noon, the Casper Star-Tribune had reposted it. By 3, the Denver Post had it on the wire. By Saturday morning, the AP had moved a national story. Theron Vosberg filed for divorce on Sunday afternoon. His attorneys hand-delivered the papers to the Sheridan County Jail before lunch. The Wyoming PSC hearing was 6 days away. The Wyoming Public Service Commission hearing was held in the 3rd-floor conference room of the state office building in Cheyenne, the same room where, 4 weeks earlier, Annette Pillsbury had told me to leave my file with her and brace myself. The room was packed past the legal occupancy limit by 9 a.m. PSC staff opened the adjoining hearing room and set up a live audio feed. The hallway filled. The lobby filled. Director Phyllis Tellingham, the senior commissioner presiding, called the room to order at 10 sharp. 2 associate commissioners sat to her left and right. The HOA's attorney, a Cheyenne litigator named Walker Bramley, sat at one table. His client was, of course, absent. Della Vosberg was at her arraignment in a different building. Theron Vosberg sat in the 3rd row, alone, with his hands folded in his lap. Vernon Crowell sat at our table with a single leather folder and a yellow legal pad. Beside us sat Annette Pillsbury. Beside her, Kit Bensonhurst. Beside Kit, Dr. Alaric Fenton. Beside Alaric, Bryn Marsden, holding her own resignation file and a separate folder of internal HOA correspondence. Behind us, Briar Knox with 2 photographers. Beside her, the Casper Star-Tribune, the Denver Post, and a senior reporter from the Wall Street Journal who had flown in from Chicago overnight. Behind them, 140 Cloud Peak residents. Director Tellingham read the case caption. She read the procedural history. She invited Walker Bramley to speak first. Mr. Bramley stood. He spoke for 9 minutes. He talked about reasonable interpretation and long-standing practice and operational necessity. He never once produced an engineering report. He never once mentioned the 1958 termination clause. When he sat down, the silence in the conference room was so deep you could hear the hum of the elevator at the end of the hallway. Director Tellingham turned to Vernon. Vernon stood. He cleared his throat once. He laid the leather folder open on the table. Director Tellingham, he said, with the Commission's permission, my client and the supporting parties will present 6 exhibits. He held up the first sheet. This is the 1958 easement deed signed by Hollister Ardmore, recorded with Sheridan County, with a termination clause in plain English, allowing the lineal heir to terminate upon written notice with 180 days grace in the event of unauthorized expansion of voltage, scope, or width. The clause was triggered by the 2010 upgrade. The termination notice was filed by my client 3 weeks ago. The clock currently stands at day 21 of 180. He held up the second. This is Dr. Alaric Fenton's 200-page engineering report, demonstrating that the line through Mr. Ardmore's property has been operating at 24,900 volts since 2010, in violation of the 4,160-volt limit in the original easement, in violation of the cooperative's own filed records, and in violation of Federal Rural Utilities Service safety standards. He held up the third. This is Mr. Bensonhurst's signed cooperative review, confirming that no scope amendment was ever filed with the cooperative or with this commission. The 2010 upgrade was done by a private contractor under a developer agreement that was never disclosed. He held up the fourth. This is the developer's 2010 county zoning application, in which the line was described as existing infrastructure, and in which no upgrade was disclosed to the county, the cooperative, or any future homeowner. He held up the fifth. This is footage, recorded at 2:11 a.m. on May 23rd, of Mrs. Della Vosberg and 4 accomplices on my client's property, illegally trenching and installing unauthorized buried cable inside the easement corridor, while criminal proceedings against the HOA were already pending. Mrs. Vosberg is currently under indictment on 7 felony counts. He held up the 6th and final sheet. And this, Director Tellingham, is a written commitment from the Powder River Rural Electric Cooperative, signed yesterday by Mr. Bensonhurst, agreeing to design, permit, and construct an alternate transmission routing around the eastern boundary of my client's property at the cooperative's standard rates, payable by Cloud Peak Estates, with completion possible inside 90 days. My client is prepared to permit the existing line to remain energized through the construction period, in the public interest, on 3 conditions. Cloud Peak Estates funds the alternate routing in full. Cloud Peak Estates pays the 12 years of unpaid easement fees with interest, totaling $43,400. And Cloud Peak Estates accepts permanent dissolution of the existing easement at the moment the alternate line is energized. He laid all 6 sheets on the table. Behind us in the gallery, Cloud Peak residents stood, slowly, 1 row at a time. Caroline Pelfrey stood. Lowell Kirkwood stood. Bryn Marsden stood. By the end of 1 slow minute, every Cloud Peak resident in the room was on their feet, silent, facing Theron Vosberg at his isolated chair in the 3rd row. He did not look back. Director Tellingham looked at Walker Bramley. She looked at Theron Vosberg. She looked at me. Mr. Ardmore, she said, on behalf of the Wyoming Public Service Commission, I find the existing line to be in violation of the original easement scope and of this commission's permitting requirements. I accept the proposed alternate routing. I order the cooperative and Cloud Peak Estates to commence construction within 30 days, and I am referring the petitioner's filings to the Wyoming Attorney General's office for investigation. She brought the gavel down once, hard. I felt Stony Reeves's hand grip my shoulder from the row behind me. The civil settlement and criminal sentencing came 9 months later. The Cloud Peak Estates Homeowners Association was reorganized by court order under a new board, with Caroline Pelfrey elected the first new president, and Lowell Kirkwood elected vice president. Della Vosburgh pleaded guilty to felony tampering with regulated utility infrastructure, felony installation of unauthorized buried cable on private land, felony filing of a fraudulent civil complaint, and felony conspiracy. She served 23 months in state custody, paid a six-figure restitution order, and was permanently barred from sitting on any homeowner's board in the state of Wyoming. Her husband, Theron Vosburgh, settled a class action disclosure lawsuit brought by 96 Cloud Peak homeowners for $41 million. He surrendered his developer's license. He moved to Arizona. The total damages awarded to me in the consolidated civil action came to $5.1 million. I did not keep most of it. I worked with Vernon, Annette, Kit, Alaric, and the new Cloud Peak board to put $4.3 million of those dollars into a thing we called the Hollister Ardmore Wyoming Land and Power Trust. The trust funded a permanent rural utility infrastructure literacy program for landowners across the state, taught in plain English at every county extension office. It funded a legal aid fund for Wyoming ranchers facing easement scope disputes, run out of Vernon's old office. It funded an annual scholarship in my grandfather's name, the Hollister Ardmore Western Power Engineering Award, given each year to a Wyoming student pursuing electrical or civil engineering. The first recipient, announced on the trust's first anniversary, was a young woman from Powell whose family had run a small-town electrical contracting business for 3 generations. Wren drove down with me to deliver the check in person. The alternate transmission routing was completed in 87 days. On the afternoon of day 173 of my termination clock, Kit Bensonhurst and I stood at the southern fence line of the ranch, watched the new feed energize on the alternate corridor, and watched the old line through my property go quietly dark for the last time. I walked the cleared right-of-way that evening at dusk, picked up the small wooden 1958 easement marker my grandfather had set in his own hand, and carried it back to the porch. It sits on the mantel now, beside Linnea's wedding ring and the field notebook Garth used for 43 Wyoming summers. The cottonwood stumps along the river bottom are sprouting. They will be saplings again in 3 years. They will be trees again, on slow Wyoming time, by the time my grandchildren are old enough to walk under them. I have learned a few things from all of this. I'd like to share them if you'll let me. The first is that paperwork outlives bullies. My grandfather signed a page in 1958 that, 67 years later, ended a multi-million-dollar dispute before it could finish a single appeal. If you have inherited land, sit with the documents. Open the fireproof box. Read the clauses nobody told you mattered. The clauses nobody told you mattered are always the clauses that matter. The second is that quiet is a kind of leverage. The loudest person in the HOA meeting is almost never the one who has read the actual deed. The one who has read the actual deed is almost always the one who walks in last, sits down quietly, and waits. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA with a clipboard and a logo, drop your story below. Tell me your county, tell me your state, tell me the moment you finally said no. I read every one. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There's a story coming up about a retired locomotive engineer in rural Pennsylvania whose HOA tried to ban him from running his restored 1928 steam train across his own property, and forgot to check what the Federal Railroad Administration had registered as a heritage corridor. You don't want to miss what he had filed in Washington. But that's a story for next time. Tonight, I'm going to walk the southern fence line at dusk. I'm going to listen to the wind in what's left of the cottonwoods. And I'm going to thank my grandfather, Hollister Ardmore, one more time for writing the 1958 deed in his own hand. It mattered. It always mattered. Wren came down from Bozeman the weekend after the line went dark. She brought a yellow Labrador puppy named Marjorie, after my mother, that she had adopted from a shelter outside Billings. The puppy spent her first night in Wyoming chewing on the leg of my uncle's old kitchen chair, while Wren and I drank coffee on the porch and watched the new line glow across the eastern bench in the soft Wyoming dusk. Wren told me she was thinking of opening her own dental practice in Sheridan in 3 years. She told me her mother would have liked the puppy. She told me she would have liked the porch.